My name is Nancy, and I am 71 years old. As a retired stockbroker, I meticulously navigated complex financial markets for over 3 decades, building a substantial retirement nest egg and paying off my cherished home in full. I raised my son Trevor as a single mother after my husband Arthur passed away, sacrificing personal luxuries and countless opportunities for his future. I funded his initial business ventures. When they failed, always believing in his potential, his inherent goodness, the bright young man I had nurtured with such devotion. Then Trevor, drowning in $600,000 of gambling debt, filed a guardianship petition against me. He presented heavily edited videos to the court, splicing innocent moments to portray me as wandering aimlessly, forgetting important things, acting confused. He coldly announced his intention to sell my $850,000 home and access my $300,000 in investments. "You're losing your mind, Mother," Trevor screamed during our last conversation. "You're nothing but a liability now," his wife Brenda added with cruel satisfaction. "Face reality, Nancy. You're finished. My dignity, my sharp mind, my entire life's work, all brutally stripped away. My very humanity dismissed like yesterday's newspaper. I felt utterly discarded, dehumanized, profoundly shamed in ways I never imagined possible. Yet as despair threatened to consume me entirely, something deep within awakened. A stockbroker's keen analytical mind ignited a cold, righteous fury. What Trevor, Brenda, and their lawyer, Mr. Davies, didn't know was my secret weapon. I had quietly hired a private detective months earlier when I first sensed their scheming. His surveillance had captured irrefutable video evidence of Trevor deliberately sabotaging my phone's GPS, causing me to appear lost and confused, and brazenly gambling away over $100,000 of his own money at the casino. My elder law attorney waited in the wings with this explosive evidence. This time, their insidious fraud wouldn't just unravel. It would expose their shocking lack of humanity, reclaim my autonomy, and restore my dignity. Sometimes the truth has a way of surfacing when we least expect it, proving that genuine love and justice can triumph over the darkest betrayal. The morning after receiving the guardianship petition, I sat in my living room, the same room where I had rocked Trevor to sleep as a baby, where I had helped him with homework, where I had celebrated his high school graduation. Now that sacred space felt like a courtroom where I was the accused. Trevor arrived with Brenda, his wife of 5 years, and their lawyer, Mr. Davies, lurking in the background like a vulture. I had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that we could have a calm, rational discussion. I had prepared my financial records, my investment portfolios, my medical reports, all the evidence of my continued sharp mental acuity. "Trevor, sweetheart," I began, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "I don't understand why you're doing this. You know my mind is as clear as it's ever been. I've been managing complex investments for decades. Just last month, I restructured my portfolio and gained $15,000. Trevor's face remained cold, devoid of the warmth I had once known. "Mom, you're clearly not well. You're losing your mind, and everyone can see it. The court will agree that you're not fit to manage your own life or your $850,000 home and $300,000 in investments." The casual way he mentioned my assets, like he was discussing the weather, sent a chill through my bones. "It's for your own good." He continued, his voice taking on a rehearsed quality. "I need this money for my startup. The opportunity won't wait. If you fight this, you'll end up on the street with nothing. At least this way you'll be taken care of." Brenda stepped forward, her smile as sharp as a blade. "Honestly, Nancy, clinging to old habits when your mind is clearly failing? It's pathetic. Trevor's startup needs funding now, and your assets are perfectly liquid. You're just a liability at this point. You have no consideration for our future, for what we need. I felt the air leave my lungs. Brenda, I've always supported Trevor's dreams. I've given him everything I could, but this is my home, my life's work. These aren't just assets, they're my security, my independence. Mr. Davies, their lawyer, stepped forward with his briefcase. A man in his 50s, with cold, calculating eyes, he spoke with the mechanical precision of someone who had destroyed many families before mine. The evidence is overwhelming, Ms. Peterson, he stated, pulling out a tablet. We have video documentation of your episodes, wandering around confused, forgetting simple tasks, making irrational financial decisions. It's best you comply quietly. This is an open and shut case. My heart shattered as I watched the doctored videos. They had taken innocent moments, me pausing to remember where I had placed my keys, me looking confused when my phone's GPS stopped working, me hesitating before making a complex investment decision, and twisted them into evidence of dementia. These videos are lies, I protested, my voice breaking. Trevor, you know me. You know my mind. I built this home, this retirement, through sheer discipline and intelligence. My records are pristine. I've never missed a payment, never made a poor investment decision. But Trevor's face remained stone cold. Mom, you're being delusional. Accept reality. The cruelest blow came when my grandchildren entered the room. Ethan, 16, and Chloe, 14. My daughter Miranda's children, whom I had helped raise, whom I had loved unconditionally. They had been coached, their innocent faces twisted into expressions of disdain. Grandma, why are you being so selfish? Ethan said, his young voice parroting adult cruelty. Just sell the old house. It's for Dad's business. You're too old for such a big place anyway. Little Chloe giggled, the sound like breaking glass. Yeah, Grandma, you're acting crazy. Just do what they say. I looked at these children I had adored, who had spent countless weekends in this very room, and saw strangers. The manipulation was complete. They had poisoned even my grandchildren against me. Trevor, please, I whispered, tears streaming down my face. I'm your mother. I raised you alone after your father died. I sacrificed everything for you. I turned down promotions. I gave up my own dreams. I funded your failed ventures without question. How can you do this to me? Trevor's response was swift and brutal. That was your choice, Mom. I never asked you to sacrifice anything, and now it's time for you to step aside, sign the papers, move into the assisted living facility we've selected, and stop being difficult. Brenda smirked. Memory Lane Gardens is lovely, Nancy. $9,000 a month, which you can easily afford once we liquidate your assets. You'll have everything you need. The trap was closing around me. They weren't just taking my money. They were taking my freedom, my dignity, my very identity. In that moment, I realized I was no longer Nancy Peterson's successful stockbroker and devoted mother. I was simply an obstacle to be removed, a resource to be harvested. I won't sign, I said quietly, finding a strength I didn't know I still possessed. I won't let you destroy everything I've worked for. Trevor's mask finally slipped, revealing the stranger my son had become. Then you'll lose everything anyway, Mom, but it'll be messier, more expensive, and more humiliating. Your choice. As they left, I sat alone in my living room, surrounded by 40 years of memories, knowing that everything I had built, everything I had loved, was about to be torn away by the very people I had given my life to protect. The harassment began immediately. Within days of our confrontation, I discovered that Trevor and Brenda had somehow gained access to my bank accounts. When I called the bank, they informed me that my financial guardians had restricted my access for my own protection. I'm sorry, Ms. Peterson, the bank representative said, with practiced sympathy. Your son provided documentation showing you're no longer competent to manage your finances. All transactions now require his approval. I stared at my phone in disbelief. But I haven't been declared incompetent by any court. This is illegal. I'm afraid I can't help you further, ma'am. Perhaps you should speak with your family. My family. The word felt like poison in my mouth. The psychological evaluation they demanded was scheduled with Dr. Smith, a man I had never met, but who I later discovered had financial connections to Trevor's business ventures. The conflicts of interest were staggering, but who would listen to a crazy old woman? Brenda's social media posts became increasingly bold. Photos of expensive dinners, new jewelry weekend getaways, all funded, I realized, by my frozen accounts. Her captions were masterfully crafted to appear sympathetic while delivering devastating blows. So grateful Trevor is responsible enough to handle his mother's finances during this difficult time, she wrote beneath a photo of herself wearing a diamond necklace I had never seen before. Managing a parent's decline is never easy, but family steps up when needed. Family first. Blessed. The comments were worse. Friends and acquaintances offering their sympathy for Trevor's burden, praising his patience and sacrifice in caring for his confused mother. My reputation built over decades of professional excellence crumbled with each post. But the most devastating revelation came by accident. I was in my kitchen making tea when I overheard Brenda on the phone in the next room. She must have thought I was napping because her voice was unguarded, cold calculating. "The old lady is costing us a fortune," she said with casual cruelty. "All this pretense of caring is exhausting. She's nothing but a burden we need to shed. Once her house is sold, we'll be free to live our lives without her constant demands for attention." I stood frozen, the teacup trembling in my hands. No, Brenda continued. "Trevor's completely on board. He's tired of pretending to care about her feelings. She served her purpose. Now it's time for us to enjoy what she's worked for. After all, it's not like she can take it with her." The laughter that followed was the most chilling sound I had ever heard. My own daughter-in-law discussing my disposal like I was an old piece of furniture. That night alone in my bedroom, I allowed myself to remember the sacrifice I had made for Trevor 23 years ago. A sacrifice so profound, so personal, that I had never spoken of it to another soul. In 1995, when Trevor was 17, I found him in the bathroom with a bottle of pills, ready to end his life. The bullying at school, the pressure to succeed, the confusion about his identity. It had all become too much for my sensitive boy. I held him that night as he sobbed, promising him that everything would be okay, that we would find help, that his pain was temporary, but his life was precious. The next morning, I made the most difficult decision of my life. I had been offered the position of regional director at Morrison & Associates, the most prestigious brokerage firm in the state. It was everything I had worked toward, the culmination of my career. The salary was extraordinary, the opportunities limitless. But taking the position would mean traveling extensively, working 70-hour weeks, being away from Trevor when he needed me most. I turned it down. I told them I had personal commitments that required my full attention. I never explained that my son's life hung in the balance, that his mental health was so fragile, that my absence could be fatal. Instead, I found the best private therapists, the most skilled psychiatrists, the most compassionate counselors. I paid for his treatment out of my own savings, over $100,000 over 3 years. I rearranged my schedule to be available for every appointment, every crisis, every moment of breakthrough. I protected his privacy fiercely. When friends asked why he seemed withdrawn, I made excuses. When teachers expressed concern, I handled it quietly. I built a wall of love and discretion around my son, ensuring that his struggle would never define him, never limit his opportunities. He recovered, slowly, carefully, but completely. He went to college, found his passion built a life. And I was so proud, so grateful that my sacrifice had saved him. Now as I lay in my bed, that same son was calling me insane, incompetent, a burden. The bitter irony was suffocating. I had given up my greatest professional opportunity to save his life, and he was using that very life to destroy mine. The next morning, Miranda called. My daughter, whom I had also raised with love and devotion, whom I had supported through her own struggles. "Mom," she said, her voice tearful but determined, "I think maybe Trevor is right. Maybe you are confused. It's hard to accept changes as we get older. Maybe it would be easier if you just signed the papers. The assisted living place looks lovely." Her words cut deeper than Trevor's rage, deeper than Brenda's cruelty. This was passive complicity, the gentle betrayal of someone who chose comfort over courage, who chose to believe lies rather than stand up for truth. "Miranda," I whispered, "I'm your mother. I raised you. I'm not confused. I'm being destroyed by people who are supposed to love me." "I know, Mom. I know. But sometimes love means making hard choices. Maybe this is what's best for everyone." After I hung up, I sat in the silence of my home, surrounded by the echoes of a lifetime of love and sacrifice. My children, the focus of my entire existence, had become strangers. Worse than strangers, they had become my destroyers. That afternoon, Trevor and his lawyer presented their generous solution. If I signed a binding agreement absolving them of any financial wrongdoing and agreed to move immediately into Memory Lane Gardens, they would forgive my past financial mismanagement and ensure my comfort for the rest of my life. The document was thick-filled with legal language designed to confuse and intimidate, but I understood its true purpose. It was a confession of incompetence, a surrender of all rights, a legal suicide note. "This is actually quite generous," Mr. Davies said with his practiced smile. "Most families in this situation aren't so accommodating. Mrs. Peterson, you're very fortunate to have such caring children." Caring children. The phrase echoed in my mind as I looked at Trevor, at Brenda, at the lawyer who was orchestrating my destruction. Caring children who spoke of me like I was already dead, who counted my assets like vultures, who had turned my own grandchildren against me. I thought of all the nights I had stayed awake, worrying about Trevor's future, all the dreams I had deferred for his sake, all the love I had poured into raising him. And I thought of the private detective's evidence, still hidden, still waiting. "I need time to consider," I said quietly. Trevor's patience snapped. "Time, Mom. You don't have time. The court date is set. Either you cooperate or you'll be declared incompetent and lose everything anyway. At least this way you keep some dignity." Dignity, another word that had lost all meaning in their mouths. As they gathered their papers and prepared to leave, I made a decision that would change everything. I would not go quietly into the night. I would not let them erase me without a fight. The truth, I realized, was my only weapon. And sometimes the truth is sharp enough to cut through the thickest web of lies. The day they came to take me from my home, I knew I was witnessing the death of everything I had believed about family, about love, about the bonds that supposedly tie us together through life's storms. Trevor arrived with a small convoy, a van from Memory Lane Gardens, 2 orderlies in matching polo shirts, Dr. Smith with his fraudulent evaluation, and Mr. Davies with his legal documents. Brenda stood beside Trevor, her face a mask of false sympathy, while Miranda lingered in the background, unable to meet my eyes. "Mrs. Peterson," Dr. Smith said with practiced kindness, "it's time for your transition. Memory Lane Gardens is a beautiful facility, and you'll be much safer there." I looked at this man who had spent 45 minutes with me, who had asked me to remember 3 words and draw a clock, who had declared me incompetent based on Trevor's lies and Brenda's manipulation. In 45 minutes, he had undone 71 years of my life. "I'm not going anywhere," I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "This is my home. I built it, I own it, and I'm not leaving." The orderlies stepped forward, their movements practiced and efficient. They had done this before I realized. They had dragged other bewildered elderly people from their homes, convinced they were providing care while they facilitated theft. "Ma'am, we can do this the easy way or the hard way," one of them said, his voice gentle but firm. "But you are coming with us today." I watched in horror as they began boxing up my possessions. My investment journals, meticulously kept for decades, were carelessly shoved into cardboard boxes. My family photos, each one a precious memory, were wrapped in newspaper like discarded items at a garage sale. My financial records, the proof of my competence and success, were sealed away like evidence of a crime. "Please," I begged, looking at Trevor, searching his face for any trace of the boy I had raised. "Don't do this. I'm your mother. I'm not sick. I'm not confused. I'm just in your way." For a moment, I thought I saw something flicker in his eyes, a shadow of doubt, a glimmer of the love we had once shared. But it was gone so quickly I might have imagined it. "Mom, this is for the best," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "You'll be happier at Memory Lane Gardens. You'll have people to take care of you." "I don't need people to take care of me," I cried, my composure finally breaking. "I need my family to love me. I need my children to protect me, not destroy me." That's when I turned to Miranda, my daughter standing silent in the corner. She was watching this horror unfold, this destruction of her mother's life, and doing nothing. "Miranda," I pleaded, reaching out to her. "Please, sweetheart, don't let them do this to me. You know I'm not sick. You know this is wrong. Your own children are watching you abandon their grandmother." Miranda's face crumpled, and for a moment I thought she might find the courage to speak. She took a step toward me, opened her mouth as if to protest. Then she looked at Trevor, at Brenda, at the powerful coalition arrayed against me, and she stepped back into the shadows. "Mom," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Maybe it's for the best. Maybe this is what has to happen." In that moment, I understood that I was truly alone, not just physically but existentially. The people who were supposed to love me unconditionally had weighed my worth against their convenience and found me wanting. As the orderlies took my arms and began to lead me toward the van, Trevor called out, "Mom, don't make this harder than it has to be. Just accept it." But it was Brenda who delivered the final blow. "Honestly, Nancy," she said with a satisfied smirk, "this house is far too much for you now. Think of it as a fresh start paid for by your own assets. You should be grateful we're taking such good care of you." My grandson, Ethan, Miranda's 16-year-old son, stepped forward then. The boy I had taught to ride a bike, whose scraped knees I had bandaged, whose report cards I had celebrated, looked me in the eye and said, "Grandma, you're crazy and embarrassing. Why don't you just die already?" The words hit me like a physical blow. I staggered, and the orderlies tightened their grip, thinking I was trying to escape rather than reeling from the casual cruelty of my own grandchild. As they loaded me into the van, I caught a glimpse of my home one last time. The garden I had tended for 20 years, the windows I had cleaned every spring, the door I had painted every few summers. It was already no longer mine. In their minds, I was already dead. The ride to Memory Lane Gardens passed in a blur of tears and disbelief. When we arrived, I was processed like a criminal being booked into jail. My personal belongings were searched. My phone was confiscated for my safety. And I was assigned to a room that smelled of industrial disinfectant and despair. That night, alone in a narrow bed, in a sterile room, surrounded by the moans and cries of other discarded elderly people, I broke down completely. The weight of my isolation, the magnitude of my betrayal, the loss of everything I had worked for. It all crashed down on me at once. And in that darkness, I found myself confessing a secret I had carried for over 30 years. A secret so profound, so carefully guarded, that it had shaped every decision I had made as a mother. Trevor was not Arthur's biological son. My husband Arthur had confessed this to me 3 years into our marriage, when Trevor was just a toddler. Arthur had had an affair before we met, and when that relationship ended, the woman had disappeared, leaving behind only a baby and a note saying she couldn't handle motherhood. Arthur had been terrified to tell me, convinced I would leave him. Instead, I had made a choice that would define the rest of my life. I chose to love Trevor as my own, to raise him as my biological son, to create a family built on chosen love rather than blood. I had helped Arthur fabricate the birth records, create the cover story, build the perfect family narrative. I had never treated Trevor as anything less than my own flesh and blood. I had sacrificed my career, my opportunities, my own dreams to raise him, believing that love was more powerful than genetics. The irony was crushing. I had spent 30 years protecting the secret of Trevor's origin, ensuring he would never feel different, never feel unwanted, never feel like he didn't belong. And now that same Trevor was calling me incompetent, stealing my assets, and disposing of me like garbage. I had given him not just my love, but my entire identity as a mother. I had made him my son in every way that mattered, and he had repaid that gift by destroying me. As I lay in that institutional bed, listening to the sounds of other forgotten people, I understood that my story was far from over. The truth I realized was not just about Trevor's parentage. It was about the depths of love, the price of sacrifice, and the power of a mother's devotion to transcend even the darkest betrayal. Tomorrow I would begin to fight back, not just for my money, not just for my home, but for the very essence of what it means to be human in a world that too often sees the elderly as disposable. The truth was coming, and it would change everything. Memory Lane Gardens was not the peaceful sanctuary its name suggested. It was a warehouse for discarded lives, a place where the inconvenient elderly were stored while their families moved on with their plans. The walls were painted in cheerful pastels that fooled no one, and the artificial flower arrangements couldn't mask the smell of industrial disinfectant and quiet desperation. From my first day, I sensed something was wrong beyond the obvious theft of my freedom. The staff treated me with a particular kind of condescension that felt rehearsed, practiced. When I mentioned my background as a stockbroker, they exchanged knowing glances. "Oh, Mrs. Peterson," said Janet, the head nurse, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You're a resident now. Dear, not a market expert. Let's focus on the present, shall we?" When I asked to see the financial news or read the Wall Street Journal, they gently took the papers away. "These might agitate you," they explained, as if my 40-year career in finance was just a delusion. I learned later that Trevor and Brenda had been generous donors to Memory Lane Gardens. They provided regular progress reports about my condition, painting me as increasingly unstable, prone to violent outbursts about imaginary financial conspiracies. The staff believed they were protecting me from my own paranoid delusions. Every conversation I tried to have about investments or market trends was met with patronizing nods and careful documentation. Mrs. Peterson became agitated today when discussing her imaginary stock portfolio. They would write in my file, creating a paper trail of my supposed decline. The visits from my grandchildren were perhaps the cruelest torture of all. Trevor and Brenda brought Ethan and Chloe for carefully orchestrated 30-minute sessions, always with staff present, always following the same script designed to reinforce my helplessness. "Grandma, do you remember who I am?" Ethan would ask, his 16-year-old voice flat and emotionless. He had been coached to speak slowly, clearly, as if I were a confused child. Chloe, now 14, would bring coloring books and children's puzzles. "These are fun, Grandma," she would say with forced brightness. "The nurses said you like simple activities now." The most devastating visit came 3 weeks after my arrival. Ethan walked in carrying a large photograph, his face a mask of calculated cruelty that reminded me terrifyingly of his Uncle Trevor. "Look, Grandma," he said, holding up the image. "Dad and I took this in front of your old house." It was a picture of them standing beside a bright red sold sign planted in my front yard. Trevor had his arm around Ethan's shoulders, both of them smiling triumphantly. My home, the sanctuary I had built with 40 years of careful planning, the place where I had raised my children, where every room held precious memories, was gone. "Dad says you don't need it anymore," Ethan continued with teenage callousness. "He says old people should live in places like this where they're safe." I stared at the photograph at my beloved garden, now trampled by strangers at the windows, where I had watched seasons change for 2 decades. My hands trembled as I reached for the picture, but Ethan pulled it away. "Dad said I could only show it to you, not give it to you. He doesn't want you to get confused about ownership." The public humiliation continued beyond the facility walls. Brenda had turned my destruction into a social media celebration. Her posts appeared with increasing frequency, each one a dagger to my heart. "Exciting news," she wrote beside photos of my empty house. "We've sold this beautiful property for $850,000. Trevor's vision for our family's financial future is becoming reality. Sometimes the hardest decisions lead to the greatest opportunities." The comments were worse than the posts themselves. Friends and acquaintances praising Trevor's wisdom in handling his difficult mother, congratulating them on their windfall, expressing sympathy for the burden of caring for someone with dementia. Brenda followed up with architectural renderings showing proposed renovations to my home. They planned to gut everything I had loved. The built-in bookshelves where I had displayed my financial awards, the kitchen where I had cooked countless family meals, the garden where I had found peace after long days of managing complex portfolios. "Can't wait to see Trevor's modern investment office in this space," she posted. "Out with the old, in with the new." My financial destruction was complete and systematic. Trevor had assumed full control of my accounts as my court-appointed guardian. My pension payments earned through decades of professional excellence were automatically diverted to an account I couldn't access. When I tried to call my former brokerage firm, I was told that all communications had to go through my guardian. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Peterson," the representative said with practiced sympathy. "Your family has informed us that you're no longer competent to manage your financial affairs. All inquiries must be submitted through proper channels." Mr. Davies, their lawyer, had created an impenetrable legal fortress around my assets. Every attempt I made to contact my own attorney was blocked. The facility staff claimed it was for my protection, preventing me from making impulsive financial decisions in my confused state. I overheard two nurses talking one afternoon as they passed my room. "The Peterson woman is high maintenance," one said. "Her family never visits except for those short check-ins. Must be exhausting dealing with someone so demanding." The casual dismissal in their voices broke something inside me. I had become a burden, a problem to be managed, a crazy old woman whose protests were just symptoms of her disease. But one evening, as I sat in my narrow bed, feeling completely forgotten by the world, something unexpected happened. Maria, a young aide who worked the night shift, approached my bed with unusual nervousness. "Mrs. Peterson," she whispered, glancing around to make sure we weren't being watched. "I found this in the donation box. Someone left it for you." She pressed a small, worn copy of The Intelligent Investor into my hands. It was an old edition, its pages yellowed with age, but inside the front cover, written in faint pencil, were two words that made my heart race: Eleanor's help. Eleanor Matthews, my former colleague and closest friend in the brokerage world. She had retired 5 years ago, but we had maintained our friendship. If she knew what was happening to me, if she was trying to help. For the first time in weeks, I felt a spark of hope. Eleanor knew, my mind knew my capabilities, knew that the woman they were portraying as incompetent was actually one of the sharpest financial minds of her generation. Maria leaned closer, her voice barely audible. "There's a phone number written on page 127. She whispered, "Someone wants you to call them, but be careful. The staff monitors everything." As she slipped away into the darkness, I clutched the book to my chest. Maybe I wasn't completely alone after all. Maybe someone somewhere was watching and waiting. Maybe the private detective's evidence was still out there ready to expose the truth about Trevor and Brenda's elaborate fraud. In the depths of my despair, Eleanor's message felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't incompetent. I was just inconvenient to people who valued money more than family profit, more than love. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. 3 months after my imprisonment at Memory Lane Gardens, Trevor launched what he called his greatest professional triumph. I learned about it the way I learned about everything now, as a passive observer, watching my own life be rewritten by others. Silver Creek Startups, Financial Innovation and Generational Wealth Conference announced the banner that filled my television screen. Trevor stood at a gleaming podium wearing an expensive suit I had never seen before, addressing an audience of hundreds. Janet, the head nurse, had turned on the business news channel during my lunch, not realizing the torture she was inflicting. "Look at that," she said admiringly. "Such a successful young man. You must be so proud of your son." I watched in frozen horror as Trevor introduced himself as a visionary investor who had revolutionized his family's financial strategy. The graphics behind him showed charts and investment models that looked suspiciously familiar because they were mine. My decades of careful research, my proprietary analysis methods, my hard-won expertise, all repackaged as Trevor's innovative genius. Traditional investment strategies are often too rigid, too risk-averse, Trevor explained to the rapt audience. My approach involves bold moves, disruptive thinking, the courage to break free from outdated methodologies that create stagnation rather than growth. Every word was a dagger. The outdated methodologies he was dismissing were the strategies that had built our family's wealth, that had funded his education, that had created the very assets he was now stealing. Brenda appeared on stage beside him, radiant in a designer dress that cost more than most people's monthly salary. She spoke about the importance of freeing ourselves from the limitations of previous generations, about having the courage to move beyond fear-based financial planning. The interviewer, a respected financial journalist I had once known, professionally asked about Trevor's background and training. Well, I learned from watching my family's struggles with conservative investing, Trevor said with practiced humility. Sometimes the people closest to us, especially as they age, become too attached to security over opportunity. My mother, bless her heart, was so focused on preservation that she missed countless chances for real growth. The camera cut to audience members nodding in understanding, completely buying the narrative that I was a cautious, outdated investor who had held back my family's potential. But the worst was yet to come. As the conference continued, they played pre-recorded testimonials from family members who had benefited from Trevor's financial wisdom. Ethan appeared on the massive screen, looking earnest and mature beyond his 16 years. My Uncle Trevor has taught me so much about modern investing, he said. We've moved beyond old-fashioned methods into digital assets and dynamic trading. My grandmother used to spend hours studying these slow, boring charts, but Uncle Trevor showed me how to make money move fast. He held up one of my old stock analysis reports, the kind I had spent years perfecting, and laughed. Look at all this paperwork, so slow. We prefer quick trades and smart technology now. The audience chuckled along with him, not understanding that they were mocking 40 years of professional expertise, reducing my life's work to the outdated ramblings of a confused old woman. Chloe's segment was even more devastating. At 14, she giggled as she pointed at my carefully constructed portfolio charts. Grandma used to read these all the time, she said with the casual cruelty that only teenagers can muster. She would sit for hours making little notes. It's so much easier now with apps and algorithms. The message was clear. Nancy Peterson represented the past, the slow, the obsolete. Trevor represented the future, the fast, the profitable. I sat in my institutional chair, my hands shaking with rage and grief, watching my professional legacy being dismantled and mocked on national television. Everything I had built, every success I had achieved, every life I had helped improve through sound financial advice, all of it reduced to a punchline in Trevor's performance. The most crushing moment came when they showed before and after comparisons of family asset management. The before showed my conservative, diversified portfolio, steady, reliable, built for long-term security. The after showed Trevor's aggressive trading results, flashy gains that I knew with my professional eye were unsustainable and dangerous. You can see the dramatic improvement in performance, Trevor explained, pointing to graphs that showed short-term profits without revealing the massive risks involved. This is what happens when you're willing to think outside the box, to trust innovation over fear. What the audience didn't know, what the camera didn't show, was that those gains were largely artificial, created by liquidating my carefully balanced investments and gambling everything on high-risk, high-reward ventures. Trevor was essentially burning through my life savings to create the illusion of genius. But then, something unexpected happened. During the live question and answer session, an older gentleman in the audience stood up. I recognized him immediately. Harold Brennan, a respected stockbroker who had worked alongside me for 15 years before his retirement. Mr. Peterson, Harold said, his voice carrying the authority of decades in the business. I'm curious about your credentials. Which firm trained you? What licenses do you hold? Because some of these strategies you're presenting as innovations, well, they look remarkably similar to the work of Nancy Peterson, one of the finest stockbrokers this industry has ever produced. The color drained from Trevor's face. For a moment, his polished facade cracked, revealing the fraud beneath. My background includes extensive family mentorship, Trevor stammered. My mother did share some basic concepts, but these applications are entirely my own innovation. Harold wasn't finished. Nancy Peterson was renowned for her ethical standards and her conservative approach to wealth building. Are you suggesting she was wrong? Not wrong. Trevor recovered quickly, just limited by the thinking of her generation. Sometimes we have to move beyond what our parents taught us to reach our full potential. The diplomatic answer satisfied most of the audience, but I could see Harold's skeptical expression. He knew something was wrong. He understood that the Nancy Peterson he had worked with would never have endorsed the reckless strategies Trevor was promoting. After the broadcast ended, I learned that Harold had contacted Eleanor Matthews, my old friend and colleague. Word was spreading through the tight-knit community of retired financial professionals that something wasn't right about Trevor Peterson's sudden rise to prominence. Eleanor, I discovered, had been quietly investigating ever since she received my desperate message through Maria. She was preparing a professional affidavit that would detail my mental acuity, my continued competence, and the suspicious circumstances surrounding my guardianship. As I sat in my sterile room that night, I realized that Trevor's moment of triumph might also be his downfall. He had gotten greedy, too confident, too public with his fraud. By putting my stolen expertise on national display, he had attracted the attention of people who knew the truth about my capabilities. The financial community was small, especially among the older generation. People talked, people remembered, and people like Harold and Eleanor had the credibility and connections to expose Trevor's elaborate deception. My professional legacy wasn't just being stolen. It was being used to build the very platform that would ultimately destroy my destroyers. Sometimes the truth has a way of surfacing in the most unexpected places, and justice finds a path even through the darkest manipulation. 6 months into my imprisonment, Trevor launched his final assault on what remained of my existence. The legal papers were delivered to Memory Lane Gardens on a Tuesday morning, carried by a courier who treated them like routine business documents rather than the instruments of my complete destruction. Mr. Davies had crafted a masterpiece of legal cruelty. Trevor was suing me for $1.5 million, claiming emotional distress, damaged reputation, and financial harm caused by my erratic behavior and delusional accusations against his character. Your persistent harassment of my client through false claims about his business practices has caused severe psychological trauma. The lawsuit read, Mrs. Peterson's deteriorating mental state has resulted in public accusations that have damaged Mr. Peterson's professional reputation and business prospects. The irony was suffocating. The son who had built his career on stolen expertise, who had destroyed my life through calculated fraud, was now claiming that I had damaged him. But the lawsuit was just the beginning. Trevor had simultaneously contacted my former brokerage firm, Garrett and Associates, where I had worked for 23 years. Using his position as my guardian, he filed a formal complaint alleging that I had engaged in unethical business practices and financial misconduct during my career. Mrs. Peterson's recent behavior has revealed a pattern of poor judgment that likely extends back decades, his letter claimed. We have reason to believe she may have engaged in unauthorized trading client manipulation and fraudulent reporting throughout her employment. The accusations were completely fabricated, but they were enough. The firm, terrified of potential liability, immediately launched an investigation that resulted in the revocation of my professional certifications and the permanent suspension of my pension benefits. Within a week, I lost not just my income, but my professional identity. 40 years of impeccable service, countless satisfied clients, a spotless record of ethical behavior, all erased by Trevor's lies and the firm's cowardice. The phone call came on a Friday afternoon. Janet, the head nurse, delivered the news with the same tone she might use to announce a change in the lunch menu. Mrs. Peterson, your pension has been terminated due to ethical violations discovered during your employment review. The facility will need to discuss new payment arrangements for your continued care. I stared at her, unable to process the magnitude of what had just happened. There were no ethical violations, I whispered. I never did anything wrong. This is all fabricated. Janet's smile was pitying. I'm sure you believe that, dear. But the important thing is figuring out how to move forward. The eviction notice came 3 days later. Without my pension, I couldn't afford the $9,000 monthly fee at Memory Lane Gardens. Trevor, despite controlling all my assets, claimed he could no longer support my care due to the financial strain of my lawsuit against him. The eviction was scheduled for maximum humiliation. Brenda had somehow alerted local media about the tragic case of an elderly woman being removed from assisted living due to family financial disputes. She framed it as a cautionary tale about the importance of proper estate planning. I watched from my window as news vans gathered in the parking lot, their cameras ready to capture my shame. The reporters had been fed a narrative about a confused elderly woman who had mismanaged her finances and was now paying the price. When the time came, I was escorted out with my few remaining possessions in garbage bags. The cameras rolled as I shuffled past, looking exactly like what they expected to see, a broken, confused old woman who had brought this suffering on herself. The footage aired that evening on 3 local stations. Elderly woman evicted from care facility after family financial dispute, read the headlines. The story portrayed me as a cautionary tale while painting Trevor as a struggling son trying to balance compassion with financial reality. Miranda appeared in one of the interviews standing beside her husband David outside their comfortable suburban home. Her words were carefully chosen, devastating in their gentle cruelty. It's very difficult, she told the reporter, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. We want to help, but we have our own family to think about. Sometimes love means making hard choices about what we can and cannot do. David was more direct. We have no legal or moral obligation to support her, he said coldly. She made her own choices, and now she has to live with the consequences. The public shelter where I ended up was a warehouse of human desperation. Rows of cots filled a former gymnasium, housing the homeless, the addicted, the mentally ill, and now, the financially destroyed. I lay on my narrow mattress, surrounded by the sounds of coughing, crying, and whispered conversations, trying to comprehend how I had fallen so far. But Brenda's cruelest blow was yet to come. 2 weeks after my eviction, she held a lavish public event to unveil Trevor's new Investment Innovation Center. The facility, built with money stolen from my accounts, was a gleaming monument to their successful fraud. The local Business Journal covered the ribbon-cutting ceremony. Young entrepreneur launches state-of-the-art financial center, read the headline. The article described how Trevor had used inherited family assets and innovative investment strategies to create a cutting-edge facility for wealth management. Brenda posed beside a bronze plaque that read, "Dedicated to visionary thinking and breaking free from traditional limitations." The inscription might as well have been my epitaph. The photos showed Trevor in his expensive suit, Brenda in designer clothing, and my grandchildren smiling beside equipment purchased with my stolen retirement savings. They had turned my life's work into props for their success story. The stress of watching my complete destruction finally broke my body. I collapsed in the shelter's bathroom, clutching my chest as pain radiated down my left arm. The heart attack was massive, the kind that kills elderly people who have lost everything they lived for. In the ambulance, as consciousness faded, I found myself remembering something I had buried for decades. A risky investment I had made for my late husband Robert against my mentor's advice. Robert had confessed to me about his gambling problem only years later, and I realized that my brilliant investment had actually been covering his debts. The memory hit me like lightning. Trevor's gambling addiction wasn't new. It was hereditary. Robert had hidden his problem from me just as Trevor was hiding his now. I had spent my career protecting one gambler's reputation only to be destroyed by another's addiction. But this time, I wouldn't go quietly. This time, I would fight back with everything I had left. The truth about Trevor's gambling, about the inherited addiction that drove his desperate theft, about the pattern of financial self-destruction that ran through our family, it would all come out. As I drifted into unconsciousness, I made a promise to myself and to the memory of the woman I used to be. I would survive this. I would expose them, and I would make sure that every dollar they had stolen was returned, every lie they had told was revealed, every moment of my humiliation was answered with justice. The machines beeped around me, measuring a heart that was broken but not defeated, monitoring a life that was devastated but not finished. I survived the heart attack, though the doctor said it was touch and go for 3 days. When I finally opened my eyes in the cardiac intensive care unit, the first face I saw was Maria, the young aide from Memory Lane Gardens. She was holding my hand, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Mrs. Peterson," she whispered, "I've been so worried. Eleanor, your friend Eleanor, she's been calling the hospital every day." My voice was barely a whisper, my throat raw from the ventilator. "Eleanor, she says she has lawyers. She says she's going to help you fight them." As I slowly recovered, the full picture of my family's betrayal became even clearer. Eleanor had been busy during my hospitalization, gathering evidence, building a case, preparing for the battle. I was too weak to fight alone, but I needed to do something first. From my hospital bed, with Maria's help, I recorded a video message. My voice was weak, my appearance haggard, but my mind was crystal clear. I laid out everything: Trevor's manipulation of the videos, Brenda's financial exploitation, the systematic destruction of my life by the people who were supposed to love me. Most importantly, I revealed what I had remembered during my heart attack. Trevor's gambling addiction, inherited from his father, the pattern of financial self-destruction that had driven him to desperate measures. I didn't reveal the secret of his parentage. That truth was still too painful, too private. But I exposed his addiction, his debts, his willingness to destroy his own mother for money. "Trevor," I said, looking directly into the camera, "if there's any part of the boy I raised still inside, you please stop this. Please remember who you used to be before the gambling consumed you. I know about the $600,000. I know about the casinos. I know about the late-night calls from creditors. This has to end." The video was raw, emotional, devastating in its honesty. I asked Maria to send it directly to Trevor, hoping against hope that seeing his mother's pain might awaken some vestige of conscience. But Brenda intercepted the message before Trevor ever saw it. What happened next was so calculated, so vicious, that it redefined my understanding of human cruelty. Brenda took my desperate plea to my son and turned it into a weapon against me. She manipulated the video with professional editing software, splicing sentences together, altering the tone of my voice, adding ominous background music. She cut out my specific accusations against Trevor and focused on my mentions of financial conspiracies and family betrayal, making me sound paranoid and delusional. The doctored video titled "Elderly Woman's Delusional Rant Against Family" was sold to a national gossip news channel for what I later learned was a substantial sum. Brenda marketed it as exclusive footage of a mentally ill woman's breakdown, complete with expert commentary from paid psychologists who had never met me. The news segment aired on a Tuesday evening, reaching millions of viewers. The anchor introduced it with practiced concern. Tonight, a disturbing look at how dementia can turn a loving mother into a source of pain for her family. This exclusive footage shows the deteriorating mental state of 71-year-old Nancy Peterson, whose paranoid accusations have torn her family apart. They played my manipulated words over images of Trevor and Brenda looking devastated, their faces masks of fake concern. My desperate plea for my son to remember his humanity was twisted into evidence of my insanity. The psychological experts analyzed my facial expressions, my tone of voice, my choice of words, all concluding that I was clearly suffering from severe dementia with paranoid delusions. They praised my family's patience and dedication in dealing with such a challenging situation. But the cruelest part was Trevor's response. He appeared on the show via satellite link, his face a perfect picture of sorrowful resignation. "This is incredibly painful for our family," he said, his voice breaking with practiced emotion. To see my mother, who was once such a strong, intelligent woman, reduced to these conspiracy theories and accusations, it's heartbreaking. The interviewer asked about my claims regarding his gambling and financial problems. Trevor's response was masterful in its manipulation. "My mother has always been suspicious of my business ventures," he said sadly. "She comes from a generation that doesn't understand modern investing. In her confused state, she's interpreted normal business activities as something sinister." He brought Ethan on camera, my 17-year-old grandson, who looked genuinely distressed. The boy had been thoroughly coached, turned into an unwitting participant in my destruction. "I just want my grandma to get better," Ethan said, his young voice heavy with manufactured sadness. "She used to be so loving, so normal. Now she just makes these scary accusations. I wish she could be the grandmother I remember." The performance was flawless. Trevor came across as a devoted son, struggling with his mother's tragic decline, while I appeared to be exactly what they claimed, a delusional old woman whose paranoid fantasies were tearing her family apart. Miranda appeared briefly in the segment, offering a few words of support for her brother. "Trevor has been so patient, so caring," she said. "It's not easy when someone you love becomes difficult." The implication was clear. I was the problem, the source of pain, the crazy old woman who needed to be managed rather than believed. But what Trevor and Brenda didn't know was that someone else had been watching, recording, and analyzing their every move. The private detective I had hired months earlier had been documenting everything, building an ironclad case against them. More importantly, Eleanor had reached out to Harold Brennan and other retired financial professionals who remembered my work. They had watched the news segment with horror, recognizing immediately that the woman they knew, sharp, ethical, brilliant, could never have deteriorated so completely without something being very wrong. Harold called the news station the next day, demanding to speak with the producers. "I worked with Nancy Peterson for 15 years, he told them. "The woman you portrayed on your show bears no resemblance to the person I know. Someone is lying here, and it's not Nancy. Eleanor went further. She hired her own video analysis expert who quickly identified the digital manipulation in Brenda's doctored footage. The timestamps had been altered, sentences had been spliced together, and my voice had been subtly modified to sound more confused and agitated. The private detective's surveillance footage told a different story entirely. It showed Trevor at casinos, Brenda shopping with stolen money, and both of them laughing about my performance as they planned their next moves. Most damaging of all, the detective had recorded conversations between Trevor and Brenda, where they discussed the precise methods they were using to gaslight me, manipulate my medication through bribed staff, and create evidence of my incompetence. "The old bat actually thinks she's going crazy," Brenda could be heard saying in one recording. "The beauty of this plan is that she's doing half our work for us." As I lay in my hospital bed recovering from the heart attack that had nearly killed me, I learned that the truth was finally surfacing. Eleanor was coordinating with a team of elder law attorneys who specialized in financial abuse cases. Harold was preparing professional testimony about my mental acuity. The private detective was organizing evidence that would expose the entire conspiracy. The news segment that was meant to destroy me completely had actually accomplished the opposite. By going too far, by being too cruel, too public, too confident in their fraud, Trevor and Brenda had attracted the attention of people with the power and knowledge to stop them. My story wasn't ending with humiliation and defeat. It was approaching the moment when truth would confront lies, when justice would answer cruelty, when a mother's love, twisted into a weapon against her, would finally be transformed back into the force for good it was always meant to be. 8 months after my heart attack, I sat in Eleanor's comfortable living room, surrounded by the most formidable legal team money could buy. The funding had come from an unexpected source, a forgotten investment account I had opened decades ago, one that Trevor had never discovered in his systematic pillaging of my assets. The account had grown to over $200,000, enough to hire the best elder law attorney in the state, a retired FBI forensic video analyst, and continue paying my private detective. "Nancy," said Margaret Chen, my lead attorney, "we're ready to file. The evidence is overwhelming. Trevor and Brenda won't know what hit them." The federal civil and criminal lawsuit we launched sent shockwaves through the legal community. We charged Trevor and Brenda with elder abuse financial fraud conspiracy to commit fraud and defamation. The case attracted national attention, with legal experts calling it one of the most comprehensive elder abuse prosecutions they had ever seen. The media coverage was immediate and intense. "Elderly stockbroker fights back against family fraud," read the headlines. Suddenly, the narrative that had been carefully constructed around my supposed dementia began to crumble as reporters investigated the claims and found them wanting. But nothing could have prepared me for the moment when we finally revealed the private detective's footage in court. The courtroom was packed with cameras, broadcasting live to millions of viewers around the world. I sat in the front row, my hands folded in my lap, watching as the truth I had fought so hard to preserve finally came to light. "Your Honor," Margaret announced, "we would like to present Exhibit A, surveillance footage taken by Mrs. Peterson's private investigator over a period of 6 months." The large screen in the courtroom flickered to life, and there was Trevor standing in my living room with my phone in his hands. The timestamp showed it was 3 days before one of my supposed wandering episodes. "What are you doing?" Brenda's voice could be heard asking from off camera. "Turning off her GPS," Trevor replied with casual cruelty. "Tomorrow we'll drive her to that shopping center across town, then leave her there for an hour. When she can't find her way back to the car, we'll have another episode to show the court. The gasps from the courtroom gallery were audible. Jurors leaned forward, their faces showing a mixture of horror and disgust. This wasn't the confused wandering of a dementia patient. It was elaborate, calculated elder abuse. The video continued showing Trevor and Brenda laughing as they planned each staged incident. "She actually thinks she's losing her mind," Brenda could be heard saying. "It's almost too easy." But the most damning footage came next. The camera showed Trevor at the Riverside Casino throwing away money with the reckless abandon of a true addict. In one evening alone, he gambled away over $30,000. Money that, according to bank records, had been withdrawn from my account without my knowledge. "Look at this idiot," Trevor said to Brenda, as they watched an elderly man struggling with a slot machine, throwing away his family's money. "At least when I win, it goes towards something worthwhile." The irony was staggering. Trevor was criticizing another gambling addict while destroying his own family through the same addiction. Margaret presented bank statements showing Trevor's $600,000 debt accumulated over 5 years of increasingly desperate gambling and failed business ventures. His startup was revealed to be nothing more than a shell company, a facade designed to justify his theft of my assets. When Trevor was called to testify, I barely recognized the man who took the witness stand. Gone was the confident entrepreneur who had appeared on national television. In his place sat a broken, trembling figure whose carefully constructed lies were crumbling around him. "Mr. Peterson," Margaret began, "do you recognize the person in this surveillance footage?" Trevor stared at the screen, watching himself manipulate my phone, watching himself laugh about my confusion, watching himself gamble away money he had stolen from his own mother. The weight of his actions displayed for the world to see seemed to crush him physically. He began, then stopped. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely hold the water glass the bailiff brought him. "Mr. Peterson, did you deliberately disable your mother's GPS tracking to create the appearance that she was suffering from dementia?" The courtroom was silent, except for the sound of Trevor's labored breathing. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "Yes." The single word seemed to break something inside him. Trevor began to sob, not the calculated tears he had shed during his television interviews, but the raw, ugly crying of a man confronting the full magnitude of his cruelty. "Did you steal money from your mother's accounts to fund your gambling addiction?" "Yes." "Did you conspire with your wife to have your mother declared incompetent so you could access her assets?" "Yes." Each admission was like watching a man disintegrate in real time. Trevor's carefully constructed public persona collapsed completely, revealing the desperate, addicted, broken individual beneath. The successful entrepreneur was revealed to be nothing more than a sophisticated thief who had been willing to destroy his own mother for money. Brenda tried to flee the courtroom when her turn came to testify, but she was quickly apprehended by court security. Her composure, which had been so perfect during her social media performances, cracked immediately under questioning. "It was all Trevor's idea," she screamed, pointing at her husband. "I just went along with it. She was old anyway. She would have died soon." The callousness of her words shocked even the experienced court officers. Here was a woman who had systematically tortured an elderly person, and her only defense was that the victim was expendable due to her age. Mr. Davies, their lawyer, sat at the defense table with his head in his hands. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Not just his participation in the fraud, but recordings of him coaching Trevor and Brenda on how to manipulate the legal system. His career was over his reputation destroyed criminal charges pending. But perhaps the most heartbreaking moment came when I looked toward the gallery and saw Miranda, my daughter, sobbing uncontrollably in her seat. She had heard every word, seen every piece of evidence, witnessed the full scope of what her brother and sister-in-law had done to me. Our eyes met across the courtroom, and I saw something I hadn't seen in years: genuine remorse, devastating guilt, and a silent plea for forgiveness that spoke louder than any words could have. The trial lasted 3 weeks, but the outcome was never really in doubt. The evidence was too overwhelming, the cruelty too obvious, the fraud too comprehensive. As I sat listening to the testimonies, watching the video evidence, seeing the financial records, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. There was vindication, certainly, relief that the truth was finally being told, but there was also profound sadness. This broken man in the defendant's chair was still my son, still the boy I had raised and loved and sacrificed for. Seeing him destroyed by his own choices was painful in ways I hadn't expected. The truth was out, but it had come at a cost I was only beginning to understand. Justice was being served, but it tasted bitter when it meant watching your own child face the consequences of choices that had hurt you so deeply. As the judge prepared to render his verdict, I closed my eyes and thought about the woman I had been before this nightmare began. Strong, independent, successful, surrounded by a family I thought loved me. That woman was gone, but perhaps someone stronger had taken her place. The judge's voice carried the weight of absolute authority as he delivered his verdict. Judge Harrison, a man in his 70s who had clearly been moved by the evidence, spoke with controlled anger about the systematic abuse that had been perpetrated against me. In 40 years on the bench, he began, I have rarely seen such calculated, cold-blooded elder abuse. The defendants didn't just steal money, they stole dignity, autonomy, and peace of mind from a woman who had devoted her life to caring for them. Trevor Peterson was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison for elder abuse, financial fraud, and conspiracy. Brenda received 8 years for her role as co-conspirator and active participant. The judge ordered full restitution of all stolen assets, plus punitive damages totaling over $2 million. This court finds that Nancy Peterson is and has always been mentally competent, Judge Harrison declared. The evidence clearly shows that she was the victim of a sophisticated fraud designed to make her appear incompetent. Her character as a financial professional and as a human being is hereby completely vindicated. Those words meant more to me than any monetary award. For months I had been told I was crazy, confused, incompetent. To hear a federal judge state unequivocally that I was the victim, not the problem, was a restoration of my very identity. The courtroom erupted in applause, but I felt strangely quiet inside. Justice had been served, but at what cost? My son was going to prison. My daughter-in-law, despite her cruelty, was also facing years behind bars. My grandchildren would grow up with parents in jail. Mr. Davies was disbarred immediately and faced additional criminal charges for his role in the conspiracy. His law license was permanently revoked, his career destroyed by his participation in my family's fraud. As the court officers led Trevor away in handcuffs, he turned to look at me one last time. His face was gaunt, aged by the stress of the trial and the weight of his exposure. For just a moment, I saw a flicker of the boy I had raised, the sensitive young man I had protected and nurtured. "Mom," he mouthed, silently, tears streaming down his face. I nodded once, not in forgiveness, but in acknowledgement of the tragedy we had all become part of. He was still my son, even if he was no longer the person I thought I knew. The media frenzy following the verdict was overwhelming. My story became a cautionary tale about elder abuse, a rallying cry for better protection of elderly people, and proof that victims could fight back against even the most sophisticated fraud. But the real healing began in the quiet moments after the cameras stopped rolling. 3 days after Trevor's sentencing, Miranda came to see me. I was staying temporarily with Eleanor while my house was being restored, and Eleanor discreetly disappeared when Miranda arrived, giving us privacy for the conversation I had been both dreading and hoping for. Miranda looked terrible. She had lost weight, her hair was unkempt, and her eyes were red from crying. When she saw me, she collapsed into sobs that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. "Mom," she whispered, "I'm so sorry. I'm so incredibly sorry." For a long moment, I just held her. My daughter, my child, the little girl I had raised to be strong and independent, was broken by the weight of her own complicity. "I was scared," she said through her tears. "Trevor was so convincing, so confident. He showed me those videos, and I wanted to believe him because it was easier than thinking he could be lying. I was a coward, Mom. I abandoned you when you needed me most." The conversation lasted for hours. Miranda told me about the pressure Trevor had put on her, the way he had systematically isolated family members who might question his narrative. She revealed that she had had doubts all along, but had been too frightened of confronting Trevor to speak up. "I knew you weren't really sick," she admitted. "Your mind was always so sharp, so clear. But Trevor made it seem like questioning him would destroy the family. I chose the easy path instead of the right path." Miranda's apology was genuine, raw, and complete. She didn't make excuses or try to minimize her role in my suffering. She simply acknowledged the truth and asked for the chance to rebuild our relationship. The process would be long and difficult, but for the first time in over a year, I felt hope about my relationship with my daughter. People could change. Trust could be rebuilt. Love could heal even the deepest wounds. My grandchildren's journey was more complex. Ethan, now 18, and Chloe, 15, had been traumatized by their parents' arrest and the public revelation of their crimes. They had been living with lies for so long that discovering the truth left them confused and angry. Ethan came to see me first, his young face marked by guilt and confusion. "Grandma," he said, his voice breaking, "I said such terrible things to you. I told you to. I said you should die. How could I have said that?" Looking at this young man, barely an adult, struggling with the weight of his family's destruction, I felt only compassion. He had been manipulated just as I had been turned into a weapon against me by adults he trusted. "You were lied to," I told him simply. "You believed what the adults in your life told you to believe. That's not your fault." Chloe's reunion with me was even more emotional. She was still a child, really, and the revelation that her parents were criminals and her beloved uncle was going to prison had shattered her world. "I don't understand," she cried. "Why did they lie to me? Why did they make me say those things about you?" Explaining adult cruelty to a teenager is one of the hardest conversations any grandmother has to have, but it was also necessary for her healing and mine. "Sometimes adults make very bad choices," I told her. "Your parents let their problems become more important than telling the truth or treating people with kindness. That doesn't mean they don't love you, but it does mean they made serious mistakes." 2 months after the trial, I received my first letter from Trevor in prison. It was pages long, written in the shaky handwriting of a man whose world had completely collapsed. "Mom," it began, "I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I need you to know that I understand now what I did to you. The therapy here is helping me see how sick I became, how the gambling addiction twisted my thinking until I could justify anything. The letter went on to detail his participation in Gamblers Anonymous, his work with a prison psychologist, and his slowly growing understanding of the magnitude of his betrayal. "I don't expect forgiveness," he wrote. "I just want you to know that the man who hurt you wasn't really me. It was what I became when the addiction took over. I'm trying to find my way back to the person you raised, but I know it may be too late." Reading his letter, I felt a complex mixture of emotions: anger at what he had done, sadness for what he had become, and a tiny flicker of hope that perhaps someday some version of reconciliation might be possible. Brenda, by contrast, remained unrepentant. Her few communications from prison were filled with bitterness and blame. She had been abandoned by everyone, including her own family, and seemed incapable of accepting responsibility for her actions. 3 months after the trial, I made a decision that surprised even me. I decided to write a book about my experience, to share my story with other elderly people who might be facing similar abuse. The memoir would be called "Fighting Back One Woman's Battle Against Elder Abuse," and all proceeds would go to funding legal aid for elderly victims of financial fraud. The process of writing forced me to relive every painful moment, but it also helped me make sense of what had happened to me. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was a survivor with a story that could help others. Justice had been served, restitution had been ordered, and my reputation had been restored. But the real victory was quieter and more personal. I had my life back. I had my dignity back. And slowly, carefully, I was rebuilding the family relationships that mattered most to me. The woman who had been dragged from her home in garbage bags had become an advocate, a survivor, and a symbol of hope for elderly people everywhere. The transformation wasn't complete yet, but it was real, and it was mine. 2 years after the trial, I stood in the doorway of my restored home, watching Miranda help Chloe with her college applications at my kitchen table. The scene was so ordinary, so peaceful, that it took my breath away. This was what family was supposed to look like. People who cared for each other, supported each other, told each other the truth. My house had been returned to me exactly as I had left it, but somehow it felt different now, more precious. Every room held memories, not just of what I had lost, but of what I had fought to reclaim. The living room where Trevor had staged his cruel interventions was now filled with the laughter of grandchildren who knew the truth and chose to love me anyway. The garden I had tended for 20 years bloomed more beautifully than ever. I had learned to see it, not just as a collection of plants, but as a metaphor for resilience. Even after the harshest winter, life finds a way to return stronger and more beautiful than before. Miranda and I had rebuilt our relationship slowly, carefully, with complete honesty. She moved back to town after the trial, wanting to be close enough to help, but respectful enough to give me space. Our weekly dinners had become the highlight of my week opportunities to share not just our present experiences, but to heal the wounds of our past. "I was thinking," Miranda said one evening as we cleaned up after dinner, "maybe it's time I learned about investing. You always offered to teach me, and I was too busy to listen." It was a small thing, but it represented something profound. My daughter was finally ready to see me, not as a burden or a problem, but as a person with knowledge worth learning, wisdom worth seeking. Ethan had graduated high school and was working part-time while attending community college. The boy who had once told me to die had become one of my strongest advocates. He helped me with technology, drove me to speaking engagements, and proudly introduced me to his friends as my grandmother, the woman who fought back. Chloe, now 17, was applying to colleges and had written her admissions essay about the importance of standing up for truth, even when it's difficult. She credited our family's experience with teaching her that integrity matters more than convenience. "Grandma," she told me recently, "watching you fight for the truth taught me that being right isn't always easy, but it's always worth it." My relationship with Trevor remained complicated, but was slowly evolving. His letters from prison had become more thoughtful, more honest, more genuinely remorseful. He was participating in every rehabilitation program available, working to understand not just his gambling addiction, but the narcissism and entitlement that had allowed him to justify hurting me. "I think about the woman you were before I destroyed everything," he wrote in his most recent letter. "Strong, independent, respected. I took that away from you, and I can never give it back. But maybe if I become a better person, if I really change, that could be a small way of honoring who you were and who you still are." I had visited him once 6 months after his sentencing. Seeing him in prison uniform, seeing the weight he had lost, and the haunted look in his eyes, I felt more sadness than anger. This was my son, the boy I had raised destroyed by choices he had made as an adult. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you completely," I told him honestly, "but I can see that you're trying to change, and that matters." It wasn't reconciliation exactly. It was something more complex. An acknowledgement that love and accountability could coexist, that family bonds could survive even the worst betrayal if there was genuine commitment to change. Brenda remained bitter and unrepentant, her letters filled with blame and self-pity. I had stopped reading them months ago, choosing instead to focus my energy on relationships that could actually heal. My book had become a bestseller, not because it was sensational, but because it was honest. Thousands of elderly people wrote to thank me for giving them hope, for showing them that they could fight back against abuse, for proving that their lives and dignity mattered. I had started a foundation to provide legal aid for elderly victims of financial fraud. The work was deeply meaningful, allowing me to transform my own pain into something that could help others. Every case we took on, every elderly person we helped regain their dignity and assets felt like another victory against the forces that had once tried to destroy me. The speaking engagements had become a regular part of my life. Standing in front of audiences of social workers, lawyers, and family members, sharing my story and educating people about the signs of elder abuse, I found a purpose I had never expected. The most important thing to remember, I would tell these audiences, is that elderly people are not burdens to be managed. We are human beings with rights, dignity, and often a lifetime of wisdom to share. When we fight for elderly rights, we're fighting for the kind of society we want to be. My days now were filled with activities I chose, people I loved, and work that mattered. I read, voraciously traveled when I wanted to manage my own finances with the same skill that had made me successful decades earlier. The woman who had once been declared incompetent was now consulted by financial advisors and quoted in business magazines. But perhaps the most meaningful part of my new life was the quiet moments. Sitting in my garden with a cup of coffee, watching the sunrise over the same landscape I had tended for decades. Having dinner with Miranda and the grandchildren, sharing stories and making new memories. Reading Trevor's letters and seeing genuine progress in his journey toward redemption. I had learned that strength isn't just about fighting back against cruelty, though that was important. Real strength is about rebuilding after the fight is over, about choosing hope over bitterness, about transforming pain into purpose. The woman who had been dragged from her home in garbage bags had become a nationally recognized advocate, a best-selling author, and a symbol of hope for elderly people everywhere. But more importantly, she had become someone who understood that survival isn't just about enduring. It's about thriving in spite of everything that tries to break you. My victory was complete, not because I had defeated my enemies, but because I had reclaimed myself. The truth had set me free, but even more than that, I had set myself free by refusing to let cruelty define my future. The sun was setting as I finished watering my garden, and I paused to appreciate the beauty of the moment. Tomorrow I would continue my work with the foundation. I would write another chapter of my next book. I would have dinner with Miranda and help Chloe prepare for her college interviews. But right now, in this perfect, peaceful moment, I was simply Nancy Peterson, a woman who had faced the worst and emerged stronger, a mother who had lost her son, but found herself a survivor, who had transformed her pain into a force for good in the world. Life, I had learned, was not about avoiding betrayal or hardship. It was about what you chose to do after the worst had already happened. And I had chosen to fight, to heal, to forgive where possible, and to build something beautiful from the wreckage of what had been destroyed. The future stretched ahead of me, full of possibility and purpose. For the first time in years, I looked forward to it with genuine joy. As I write these final words, 5 years have passed since that terrible day when Trevor and Brenda dragged me from my home, convinced they had successfully destroyed an inconvenient old woman who stood between them and their greed. Today, I sit in that same home, in the same chair where I once felt so powerless, but everything has changed. My days now overflow with purpose and joy. Miranda stops by every Tuesday for our standing coffee date, where we discuss everything from current events to family memories we're rebuilding together. Ethan calls every Sunday to share stories about his job at a financial planning firm, inspired by watching me reclaim my professional legacy. Chloe sends photos from college, where she's studying social work, with a focus on elder advocacy, determined to continue the fight I started. The foundation I established has helped over 300 elderly victims of financial fraud recover their assets and dignity. My book continues to give hope to families facing similar struggles. The speaking engagements allow me to travel the country, sharing a message that resonates in community centers, legal conferences, and family workshops. Elderly people are not disposable, and it's never too late to fight for truth. Trevor writes every month from prison, his letters showing gradual but genuine growth. He's becoming the person I always hoped he could be, though it took losing everything for him to find his way back to his humanity. Our relationship may never fully heal, but it has transformed into something honest, which is perhaps more valuable than what we lost. The greatest lesson from my journey is this: our worth as human beings isn't determined by our age, our vulnerability, or our dependence on others for care. It's determined by our courage to stand up for truth, our refusal to accept abuse as inevitable, and our commitment to fighting for dignity, not just our own, but for every person who has been told they don't matter anymore. To anyone listening to my story who recognizes their own struggle within it, please know this: you are not powerless. You are not crazy. You are not a burden. Your voice matters, your dignity matters, and your fight for justice matters. Truth has a way of surfacing even when it seems buried beneath mountains of lies and manipulation. The woman I am today, peaceful, purposeful, surrounded by genuine love, and engaged in meaningful work, was forged in the fires of the worst betrayal imaginable. But fire doesn't just destroy, it also purifies. It burns away everything false and leaves behind only what is real, what is strong, what is true. I am Nancy Peterson. I am a survivor, an advocate, a grandmother, a friend. I am living proof that it's never too late to reclaim your life, never too late to fight for truth, and never too late to transform your deepest pain into your greatest purpose. And that perhaps is the most beautiful victory of all.